Life design is not only about structure and stability, it is also about making space for the parts of yourself that make you feel alive. There are moments when something simple reveals something deeper. Sometimes in the middle of an ordinary conversation, a woman begins to talk about something she has always wanted to do, and in that moment, something changes. Her energy shifts, her voice becomes lighter, and there is a sense of possibility. It is subtle, but it is there. And then, just as quickly, life returns. Responsibilities, schedules, and everything that needs to be done. The moment fades, but the spark itself does not disappear. It stays not as something urgent, but as something waiting. When you look more closely, it becomes clear that what is holding her back is usually not a lack of skill, intelligence, or even time in the way people think. What is often missing is something much quieter: permission. Not permission from others, but permission from within, because many women already know what lights them up, but there is a quiet belief that says, "I'll do it later," or "It's not important right now," or "I should focus on everything else first." What is missing is the moment where they realize that this matters too. Most of the time, she's surrounded by roles: mother, partner, professional, caretaker, and very rarely is she seen as someone with her own inner world, someone creative, someone with something to express. Over time, that part becomes quieter. It is not gone, just less visible. So when it appears even briefly, it feels different. Starting can feel difficult, not because it is hard, but because it feels big and undefined, like something that requires more time than she has. But in reality, what is needed is something much smaller, a safe place to begin. One idea written down, one page opened, one thought captured, not a finished result, just a beginning. This is not about motivation, because motivation comes and goes. What creates change is something more steady, a gentle rhythm, a quiet return, something that keeps her connected without pressure or demand, just a reminder. And underneath all of this, there's something deeper. This is not really about writing or creating or any specific activity. It is about remembering who she is outside of everything she carries. That is why her energy changes. That is why something lights up, because that part of her is still there. When we begin to notice these moments, something shifts. The gap between wanting and doing no longer feels like failure. It begins to look human. And instead of pushing or forcing, we begin to slow down and observe what is really there. Over time, that awareness allows us to understand more clearly and to gently return to what we once set aside. And sometimes that is where everything begins. In any system, there are phases where input does not immediately translate into output. A recent observation reflected a pattern that is not uncommon. There are periods where consistent effort does not immediately produce visible results. Applications are submitted, opportunities are pursued, and yet responses remain limited or delayed. This is not necessarily a reflection of capability or value. In many cases, it is influenced by timing, market conditions, or structural factors outside individual control. From an objective standpoint, these phases are part of broader cycles. What remains within control is how time and energy are used during these periods. Value is not determined by a single outcome or response. It is developed through continued learning, skill refinement, and the ability to remain steady in uncertain conditions. What remains within control is how time and energy are used during these periods. Value is not defined by a single response or opportunity. It is built through continued learning, skill development, and the ability to remain steady in uncertain conditions. This is something I came to understand through my own experience. There was a period where I was building my personal brand without any direct financial return. From the outside, it could have appeared unproductive. But during that time, something else was happening. I was learning new skills, exploring new tools, especially in artificial intelligence, building the foundation of my business, developing a broader understanding of assets, and new approaches to income. None of it produced immediate results, and none of it came from waiting for an opportunity. It came from choosing to develop. Over time, something began to shift. Opportunities started to appear from unexpected places. Income increased, not as a direct result of a single effort, but as a byproduct of consistent development. The result was not immediate, but it was cumulative. So when looking at periods where nothing seems to be happening, it may be useful to shift the frame. Instead of asking, why is this not working? A different question becomes more useful. What is being built during this time? Because in many cases, what appears to be a pause is actually a phase of preparation. The absence of immediate results does not mean the absence of progress. And sometimes the direction forward does not come from the door that remains closed. It comes from the one that is gradually being built. In any system, output depends on stability, not intensity. The same applies to the human system. There is often a tendency to focus on doing more movement, more discipline. But these are not stable conditions. They fluctuate. What determines consistency is something more fundamental, a stable baseline. This is not about feeling motivated or energized. It is about the ability to remain steady without constant adjustment. There are periods where all the right actions are present. Movement is consistent. Sleep is maintained. Nutrition is steady. Structure is in place. And yet the system can still feel unstable, not overwhelmed, not reactive, but slightly disconnected, as if something inside is missing. This is often not a lack of discipline. It is a transitional phase. When the system begins to move out of constant demand, intensity drops before stability is fully established. What remains is a space that had not yet been anchored. During this phase, there is a tendency to add more activity, but stability does not come from increasing input. It comes from allowing the system to settle. Not every moment needs to be used. A system that is always engaged has no reference point for stillness, and at times the system also needs a way to clear what it is holding, not by solving, but by allowing it to move. For some, this happens through stillness. For others, through expression and integration. What supports this is simple. Consistent exposure to light, regular movement, steady nutrition, predictable sleep. But alongside structure, something else is required, unstructured presence. Moments where there is no role to perform, no outcome to produce. These moments may appear unproductive, but they serve a different function. They allow the system to release, to process, and to reorganize. Over time, this creates a stable operating state, not through intensity, but through consistency without pressure. There are patterns that form early, often without being named. In environments where consistency is uncertain, or where support does not always feel stable, the system begins to adapt, not consciously, but through repetition. A tendency develops to stay ahead of uncertainty, to initiate, to plan, to maintain direction. not as preference, but as a way to create stability. Over time, this pattern becomes familiar. Control begins to feel natural, not as something excessive, but as something necessary, and in many situations, it works. Things move forward, outcomes are created, direction is maintained, but what begins as adaptation can gradually become the default way of operating. There are patterns that feel productive, but over time begin to show a different effect. One of them is control, not in an obvious way, but in how actions are consistently initiated, directed, and carried forward. For a long time, this can appear effective. Things move, plans happen, progress is visible, but when looking more closely, a different pattern begins to emerge. When I am the one initiating, conversation continues. But when I stop, it stops. Not because something's wrong, but because the system was being carried by one side. Over time, this begins to require more energy, not in intensity, but in consistency. Always starting, always maintaining, always moving things forward. The same pattern appears in planning. When everything's structured and directed from one side, things do happen, but gradually participation from others becomes less active, not because they are unwilling, but because there is no role left to step into. The system becomes complete before anyone else enters it. And when outcomes are pushed, something else begins to narrow. The natural movement of events, the space where things unfold without force. In trying to secure direction, the system loses its ability to receive. This is not a failure of behavior. It is the result of a system that has been optimized for control. But over time, control reaches a limit, not because it stops working, but because it begins to restrict what can enter. When everything is directed, nothing unexpected can arrive. And this is where a different kind of awareness begins. When everything is controlled, there is no space left for anything else to participate. The Transition Phase, Life Design Series. There are times when a pattern is no longer being followed, but a new way of operating has not yet fully stabilized. During this phase, something becomes noticeable. There is awareness, there is intention, there is a clear decision to move differently. And yet, the system does not feel fully aligned. There are moments of clarity, followed by moments of pull, not because the new way is unclear, but because the old pattern is still active. The system is familiar with one way of regulating, seeking response, seeking reassurance, maintaining connection through action. When that pattern is interrupted, the system does not immediately settle, it responds. There is an urge to return, to re-engage, to restore what is known, not as a conscious decision, but as a learned response. There is a point where something changes. When the pattern is not followed and the system is allowed to remain in place, a different response begins to form. Stability does not come immediately, but it builds. Each time the old pattern is not reinforced, the system adjusts, not through force, but through repetition. And over time, something becomes clear. The new way begins to feel safe. There was a time when this shift happened in a different way, in a fully contained environment, a meditation retreat, where the structure was simple and consistent. The system was given one direction. Each day was centered around stillness, observation, and repetition. There was no interruption, no external demand, no reinforcement of old patterns. In that environment, the system adapted quickly. Within days, the previous way of operating faded, not because it was removed, but because it was no longer activated. Attention was no longer pulled outward. It was held in one place long enough for a different pattern to form. And as that happened, the baseline began to shift, without resistance, without force, simply through consistency. What was once unfamiliar became stable, because it was the only pattern being reinforced. The difference now is not the ability to change, it is the environment. In daily life, the old pattern is still present. Triggers exist. Interactions continue. Familiar cues remain, so the process appears slower, but it is not less effective. It is simply more integrated. What feels like instability is not a failure of the new system. It is the coexistence of two systems, one familiar, one emerging. And each time the new way is maintained, even briefly, it strengthens. Before moving into how to see this clearly, there is a way to stay grounded in the present. Because without something to anchor the system, it is easy to slip back into the old story. The mind begins to connect the current moment with the past. The response becomes familiar. And without noticing, the system is no longer responding to what is happening now. It is responding to what has already happened. So a simple approach is needed, not to control the reaction, but to bring awareness back to the present, to separate what is happening now from what has already been experienced. One way to see this clearly is to separate observation from emotion, to write down what had actually been experienced, not to assign blame, but to recognize patterns. Needs weren't met, presence wasn't consistent, and something was missing all along. This is not to stay in the past. It is to stop unconsciously carrying it into the present. There is a reason why time matters in this process. Without stepping back and seeing clearly, it is easy to stay in a cycle of fixing, trying to adjust, trying to make something work. But without clarity, that effort can continue for a long time. It is like moving forward with certainty, putting in energy, climbing step by step, only to realize later that the direction was never aligned. Not because the effort was wrong, but because the understanding was incomplete. And without that recognition, the same pattern can repeat. More effort, more time, more attempts, but no real change. This is where time becomes important, not as something that passes, but as something that reveals. Time provides clarity. Years of experience already contain information. What has been consistent, what has not changed, what has been available, and what has not. This is not judgment, it is recognition. When something has been observed over a long period of time, it does not need to be re-evaluated in every interaction. Detachment allows interaction without entanglement. It creates space between what is happening now and what has already been experienced. Without that space, every interaction becomes layered. Meaning is added, expectation is added, history is carried forward, and the system begins to respond to more than what is present. But with detachment, something changes. The moment becomes lighter. There is less need to interpret, less reaction, less need to control the outcome. Detachment also creates a different kind of liberation. When you stop from needing a specific response, stop trying to be understood in that moment. Freedom from having to resolve everything at once. It allows you to stay where you are without being pulled into what was. And because of that, energy is no longer used to manage the interaction. It becomes available again. From that clarity, communication changes. Simple, direct, based on the present. Not driven by the need to be seen or validated, but by what is needed. This is where detachment becomes functional. You can engage without re-entering the old story. In any system, stability determines the quality of output. The same applies to the human system. There are periods where actions are present, effort is applied, and structure is in place. And yet decision quality begins to decline. Not because of a lack of knowledge, but because the system is no longer operating from stability. There is a pattern that often sits underneath this, a tendency to seek safety through external conditions, through outcomes, through people, through response. When stability is tied to what is outside, the internal state becomes reactive to change. And when that stability shifts, decision-making follows. This is not a failure of discipline. It is a system that has been relying on external reference points for safety. Over time, this creates pressure, more action, more effort, more attempts to secure outcomes. But stability does not increase, because what is missing is not more input. It is internal support. There's a point where this becomes visible, where continuing in the same pattern no longer improves results. And this is where a different approach begins, not by adding more structure, but by changing where stability is created. Instead of seeking safety externally, the system begins to generate it internally. This can start in a simple way through reflection, through awareness, through self-guidance. At times, this takes the form of speaking to oneself, not as reaction, but as support, not to solve immediately, but to create stability in the moment. Sometimes this means stepping into a different perspective, speaking from a future version of self, one that is not reacting but observing, one that is not uncertain but steady. This is not imagination. It is creating a stable reference point within the system. When internal safety is present, something begins to shift. Decision quality improves. Actions become more selective. There is less urgency to force outcomes. The system no longer needs to compensate for instability. It begins to operate from clarity. This shift does not require external change. It begins internally, and over time, it reflects in everything else, in choices, in pacing, in what is pursued and what is left alone. A system that is supported internally does not need to overextend externally. Stability becomes the baseline, and from that baseline, decisions become cleaner, consistent, not perfect. Over time, this is what changes the outcome. Stability over intensity, self-guidance over control, internal safety over external validation. I am safe. I am steady. I am supported from within. I do not need to rush. Nothing needs to be forced. My system is stable. I can move without urgency. I can trust my own pace. I can allow things to unfold. That is enough. There's something I've been noticing that's a little different. When I try to change something too quickly or push it into place, there's this tension that shows up. And it's not just internal. It actually starts to sit between me and the thing I'm trying to reach. Over time, I started to see it's not always that something isn't available. Sometimes it's that the tension itself is pushing it away. And when that tension drops, even a little, something opens. There's more space, and things can start to move without being forced. There's also something important to remember in the middle of all of this. When everything feels chaotic, it can feel overwhelming. like nothing is clear yet, but this is only part of the whole, not the full picture, just like the body knows how to heal even when there's pain. The system is also adjusting, even when it doesn't feel stable yet. And over time, what feels intense now softens. What feels uncertain now begins to settle. There's also another shift that's been happening. Instead of feeling like I'm moving towards something, it starts to feel like I'm moving from it. Like the version of me that already has what I've been trying to reach is the one making the decisions now. From that place, goals don't feel like something I have to chase anymore. They feel familiar, not imagined, just recognized. What used to feel like something I needed to achieve starts to feel like something I've already moved through, like a memory. There's also a different way this starts to feel. It doesn't feel like everything is happening in a straight line anymore. More like the past, present, and future are all connected. And what I've been trying to reach begins to feel like something I already have. Not something I'm chasing, but something I'm remembering. Time starts to feel different too. Things that used to feel late don't carry the same weight. And what's here right now doesn't feel like something I need to hold on to. It can just be experienced while it's here. And when I'm not trying to hold it, there's no resistance when it changes. There's something I've been noticing more clearly throughout the day. At any moment, I can pause and ask, what state am I in right now? Not what I'm thinking, not what's happening, just what state. And most of the time, it comes down to two. Either there's tension, everything feels a little tighter, a little more urgent, thoughts move faster. There's a sense of needing to fix something, respond to something, figure something out, or there's space. Nothing is being pushed. Things feel more open, more manageable. There's no need to rush into a response. And what's been interesting is noticing how different everything looks depending on that state. In one state, the same situation can feel heavy, complicated, like something needs to be solved right away. And in another, nothing about the situation has changed, but it doesn't feel the same. There's more clarity, more distance, more choice. So instead of trying to fix what I'm thinking in that moment, what's been more useful is just noticing the state first. Because when the state shifts, everything else shifts with it. And most of the time, that shift doesn't come from thinking differently. It comes from coming back to the body, stepping away, moving, walking, letting the system settle from the inside instead of trying to solve it from the head. And I've started to notice how easy it is to stay in that mental loop. Everything moves fast. Thoughts keep going. There's always something to process. But when everything stays there, it becomes harder to access anything deeper. And the moment attention comes back to the body, something changes. The state shifts first, and then everything else follows. And it's not always about what's happening right now. It's something that's already there, something I'm still holding. Resentment, frustration, things that haven't fully moved through. Even when the moment is small, the response carries more weight. And I started to notice what that does. It creates tension again. Even when nothing is happening, the system is still holding something. And from that place, it's harder to stay open, harder to stay present. Sometimes what's being held doesn't come from now. It can come from much earlier. Things that didn't fully make sense, things that felt unfair. Over time, that turns into something quieter. Not always obvious, but still there. And it doesn't always show up directly. Sometimes it just feels like tension, resistance, or something not fully settled. And I've started to see it's not always about understanding it or explaining it. Sometimes it's just about recognizing that something is still being held, because holding it doesn't change anything outside, but it changes how everything feels inside. And over time, it becomes clear. Holding resentment is like carrying something that only I am feeling. So the release isn't for them, it's for me. Not to forget, not to justify, but to stop holding it in the body. And when that starts to loosen, something else happens. There's less tension, less weight, and the same situation doesn't feel the same.